One of the nice things about what I do is there is an endless amount of movies to watch, old movies, new movies, limitless. And I haven't been able to delve back into like the Hammer films from like the 50s and 60s. Now I finally get to do that with probably one of the greatest Horror of Dracula from 1958. Let's go. Horror of Dracula stars Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing, and is directed by Terrence Fisher. What's up, guys? Welcome to a patron request. This is for Thomas Jones. Thank God Thomas Jones requested this movie, Horror of Dracula. Sometimes I just need that push, and my patrons are always there to give me that push into different genres or just movies I haven't seen yet. And I've always been curious about the older Christopher Lee, Peter Cushing movies, and Vincent Price.
A creature who destroys all whom he touches. Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night to inflict his terror upon the innocent and the unsuspecting.
I think from 1970 and on is kind of my prime area of horror. I haven't really ventured that far back, of course, besides like Psycho and Rosemary's Baby. But, you know, the Hammer horror films, the old Universal monster films, although I have seen Frankenstein, I think a couple times even I've seen Frankenstein. There's definitely a great quality to those movies, and I like how different they are than, you know, today's fare. I mean, it's just so far removed from today, but you can definitely see the influence in a lot of today's movies as far back as like the Hammer films. So huge thank you to Thomas Jones for requesting that I do this one. If you are of a certain tier, then you can get a request in your honor. So become a Drumdums patron, people. Oh, by the way, guys, real quick, and this is futurely because I already finished the review, but I had to turn the camera back on because I had to show you this, all right? This is the Horror of Dracula DVD. Somebody sent me a box set with these a few years ago. And I was like, oh, I'm gonna grab this. I'm gonna watch this edition, this DVD. Love that artwork too. But I open it up to watch the movie, and you know, by the way, I love these Snapcase DVDs. You know, here, front of the disc, right? Now look at the back of this disc. Those are not scratches, okay? That is just decay. And I've read up on this that there's a lot of DVDs and Blu-rays that have a shelf life, and they do decay after so long, I guess, and they become unplayable. You know, I think like American Psycho, I've heard that one, like the first edition of that one, if you throw it in, it might be unplayable. So if you get, I'm sure most of you have that one, check it out. But yeah, I mean, the back of that, just wow. And when I put it in, my player was just like, what the fuck is this? And it wouldn't play it. And I tried a couple times. So I ended up buying this on Amazon Prime for $5 for the HD version. So if you want it on Amazon Prime, definitely get it for $5 if you don't have the DVD, okay? So, hey, there's a promotion for digital, okay, right? Anyway, guys, back to the review. But first off, let's give you a quick plot synopsis. We all know the Dracula story, right? I think a lot of us might have been introduced to the character with maybe Francis Ford Coppola's Bram Stoker's Dracula from 1992. I saw that movie in the theater. Loved it. And I feel like every Dracula movie seems to have a different tone and feel to them, which makes it great. This is pretty much the same story, but I would dare say it's quite a bit more stripped down and simple than Francis Ford Coppola's. I feel like Francis Ford Coppola's dug deeper into the novel. Whereas this one, it takes what is necessary to be told in the novel. That could be because of budget limitations back then in 1958, or it could have been just a creative choice. I'm not sure, but I might say that I prefer this version over Francis Ford Coppola's. And that's a tall order because I love Francis Ford Coppola's. Gary Oldman's performance in that movie is the stuff of legend. But if you compare Gary Oldman to Christopher Lee, two completely different animals. But the basic story is, at least for 1958, you got this character Jonathan Harker. He is coming to Dracula's castle in Romania for a job. He's going to be Dracula's librarian, which is kind of interesting because I believe in Francis Ford Coppola's, he's actually a lawyer, an attorney. So different skill sets there, but in this one, yeah, he's there to kind of organize Dracula's massive library. And when he gets there, Dracula's not there initially to meet him, although eventually he does, but it almost seems like any other business exchange. Dracula takes care of Jonathan, sets him up with his room. Mi casa, su casa. I'm not going to be here that much, so, make yourself at home. And, you can get to work right whenever you want. And, oh, by the way, I want to suck your freaking blood. He doesn't say that at the end, but we all know it. Also, Dracula, he notices Jonathan's fiancée, Lucy. You can tell he's a little bit curious. I don't know if you'd say smitten if you're watching the movie for the first time, but you can tell that he's interested, curious about his fiancée. And, he looks over the picture and then he vacates the premises. And then later, we all know he gets to Lucy and, takes her under Dracula's spell. And I hate to constantly compare this to Francis Ford Coppola's, but in that movie, there's more of a courtship between Dracula and Lucy. Whereas in this movie, he's pretty much a monster. There is no real courtship or anything like that. She's his prey. And it's much more matter of fact and abrupt. And I like that. I like the tone of this movie and how you see Dracula as a full-fledged monster. And that's a nice segue into our first, I guess, scene of violence in the movie. It's in the first act of the movie, and Jonathan, he is approached by this female who we find out is Dracula's bride. And in this movie, there's only one, whereas in the Francis Ford Coppola, you have 3 women. And I think in the book too. But in this one, yeah, just one. She looks to Jonathan for help. That's what she's telling him. I need to escape. And he's just puzzled by the whole thing. And then, boom, immediately she just attacks him. And then Dracula rushes out, and I just love the way this scene plays out because you get this close-up of Dracula's face. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. It's the horror, and he just looks like a monster. And Christopher Lee really captures that, perfectly. And it's a scene that feels violent, even though it's not really. It's more about just the approach of the scene and how chaotic it feels, the music by James Bernard, and it just immediately sets this up as a terrifying movie. So Jonathan is eventually bitten, and then not until like maybe 30 minutes into the movie are we introduced to Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing. Let me just segue right here because you guys know I'm a Halloween fan. I'm always talking about Loomis and how could you ever recapture Donald Pleasence's performance. After watching this movie, watching Peter Cushing's performance as Van Helsing, I can see where Donald Pleasence, I don't want to say he took inspiration from Peter Cushing, but maybe it's just that era of actors because Donald Pleasence was of that age. As a matter of fact, Peter Cushing was actually approached to play Dr. Loomis, and he turned it down. I think there are few actors like Peter Cushing and even Christopher Lee that have this commanding masculine approach to a character such as Van Helsing. That's pretty much what Loomis is anyway. He's a Van Helsing type character. Peter Cushing's performance in Horror of Dracula is one of the greatest performances of this type of character. He commands the screen with every scene that he's in. And from the moment that he steps into the movie, he's in it for quite a bit. He's in it far more than Christopher Lee is, actually. As a matter of fact, Christopher Lee only has 16 lines in this entire movie. But you would swear that he's all over the movie because of how great his performance is. He's Christopher Lee. He's a freaking legend. It's crazy that this is the first time I've seen this movie. This is easily my favorite interpretation of the character of Dracula. Now, I've never seen the Bela Lugosi version. That stands to be seen, but right now it's going to be hard to beat Christopher Lee. He is scary as Dracula in this movie. But if you do some reading up, he's still supposed to be kind of seductive. You know, the idea is when he enters the room, the women find him immediately intoxicating. And Christopher Lee sells that. He definitely does. Just as you know, in his, I guess what you would call a human state, it looks like a very charismatic, good-looking man. It doesn't look like a monster at all, but as soon as he turns it on and becomes Dracula, and it's just really the teeth and the eyes, but he sells it. And it helps that Christopher Lee has that voice that he has. And he just takes the profession very seriously. You can tell that he was really into this character. Even though he only wanted to play Dracula, I think, twice. You know, he came willingly twice. But he cared about the other actors and the crew and the studio so much that he chose to keep going with the character. You know, almost a sense of guilt that he had. You know, if I don't do these movies again, then a lot of people will be out of work. That was his line of thinking. Definitely curious to go and check out some more of the Hammer Dracula films as well. Horror of Dracula is a great title, and originally I kept looking to find this movie, and I kept typing Dracula, not knowing that it was called Horror of Dracula, but eventually I figured that out. And I like that title, actually. And it's a title that they chose only in the US because they didn't want to confuse it with the original Dracula from the 30s. You know, but in the UK, I believe it was just called Dracula. But it's a film that was kind of groundbreaking in its time. I mean, they made it for, I believe, like 80,000 pounds, and it went on to make like 25 million US, which at the time, 1958, it might have been one of the highest grossing independent films of all time. I don't know, I'd have to do my research, but that's a pretty big spread. And it's still one of the most influential horror films to this day. I constantly hear people talking about Christopher Lee's Dracula and you know, the 1958 Dracula film. And it's not just because of Christopher Lee, it's also because of Peter Cushing and that phenomenal performance as Van Helsing. But I could not finish up this review without talking about really just the opening of the movie and the music and how it just really sets the tone. We see Dracula's castle. It just has this gothic feel to it, really unlike any other movie I've ever seen, even though we've seen, you know, some gothic movies ever since. But there's just a unique quality to the Hammer films that is kind of unmatched. Also, the special effects at the end of the movie, you know, this is 1958, there's no CGI at the time, and, you know, everything's practical, and you got to figure out the best way to present this. Even in terms of practical effects. Just think of like John Carpenter's The Thing, and they were doing practical effects that had never been attempted before. So this is way back in 58, and it still works, you know, whatever you got to do to tell the story. And I say this film is quite effective in terms of a horror movie. It's terrifying, even at times. It's a product of its time because it just has that classic style to it, and you probably wouldn't see films and even actors with this approach these days. But after watching this movie, I can definitely see its influence on everything that came after. And horror it's kind of a niche genre these days, even though I'd say horror is really what kept Hollywood afloat during COVID. But it's just that genre that, you know, there's no limits in terms of a low budget. You know, I've seen horror films made for freaking, you know, $100,000 because it doesn't really take that much money, you know, in terms of Hollywood budgets to make an effective horror movie. And that's why horror will just never die because the quality is there. This film feels like quality just because of the performances, not just Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee, but, you know, all across the board. All the actors do a phenomenal job. And the movie's directed in a way that it really lifts the legend of Dracula and how formidable and scary this villain is. So no surprise here, trapped on a freaking island, Horror of Dracula is fantastic. And I think it gave me the boost I needed to dive into more Hammer films and even some more of the Universal monster movies. I like this era of Hollywood. And, you know, I do go through phases. You know, I went through my like Italian horror phase, and I went through my like early 70s phase. I'll probably always be in those phases. I find that the older I get, the farther back I like to go. You know, that seems to be the stuff that's my comfort zone these days, that I really enjoy the most. Stuff that makes me want to constantly rewatch, you know, because I watched Horror of Dracula twice already. It's that great of a movie. Horror of Dracula, have you seen it? Let me know down in the comments. Looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Also, be sure to come over to Killer Flicks, where we talk horror all day and every day. And on Fridays, we do Free for Fridays. Follow me at Drumdums on all my socials. Support me on Patreon. Buy me a coffee. And you guys, thank you so much for watching. Have a great day. Rum Dum out.